Hey everybody, welcome to another video in my Intro to HTML series. This video is going to be a shorty. I'm going to talk about something called the div, D-I-V. Div is a special kind of element. It is a element that doesn't really have any real semantic value. Um, Div is short for division, or like division of space. And what we do is we use those to organize content within our pages. I'm going to show you what divs look like. I'm going to play around with divs a little bit in a fresh document, and then I'm going to see how I can work them into the document that we've been working on for a while. I'm just going to copy all this markup really quickly here. Copy it, file new, paste it. I'm going to get rid of everything in the style sheet. I'm going to keep my header and my nav. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff in most of these articles here. I'm going to keep one paragraph down at the bottom. So what I have is an article with a paragraph, a nav, and a header with an H1 and a footer. I'm going to save it, file, save as, and it's going to go, going to just make a new one, unit 6. divpractice.html. Save it as an HTML file. Saved. Open it in the browser, and here's what I've got. It's just a really simple web page. I've got my header with my H1, I've got my nav with my links, I've got an article that contains a paragraph, and I've got my footer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a div in here. I'm going to put a div inside the article above the paragraph. And I'm just going to put a paragraph in it with a little bit of text. Save it and refresh it and look it in the browser. Well, that div didn't seem to do much, did it? I've got my paragraph with a little bit of text right there, but the div didn't do anything special. A div is a totally unstyled element. In other words, it's got no default styling for margins or padding or border or text or anything like that. It's just a blank, unstyled element that we use to divide up space. What we do is we use these to create large structures in our document, things like columns or feature sections or other things like that. They're used all over the place. And we style them. We give them height and width. We give them background colors. We give them all kinds of stuff. Okay? So I'm going to just style this div for a second here. I'm going to go div, select it. I'm going to give it a width. I'll set the width of the div to 50%, and I'm going to give it a background color so we can see it. Nah, not red, that's gross. Sky blue. Save it, refresh it. Now you'll see that my div is 50% the width of the browser, and it's sky blue, and it is collapsed all the way down to the content. In other words, there's no padding around it, there's no margin around it, it's a box, an unstyled box. Right now it's 50% wide, and it's sky blue. The div has all of those properties that we've talked about with the box model. It's got height, it's got width, it's got margin, it's got padding, it's got border. So if I wanted to, I could give it a margin, 2%. I can give it a padding, 4%. And you can see that I'm styling this div just a little bit. Okay? Well, what's really the purpose of this? I could do that with a paragraph, or I could do that with an article. Why am I doing that with a div? Well, I'm going to show you one way that we can use divs that comes in very handy. And you might do this on the Next assignment. I'm going to put a div around all of my content. It's going to wrap up the whole thing. Div opens, it opens above the header. And since header and everything is going to be nested inside of it, I'm going to tab all that over. And it's going to close below the footer. Okay? So div closes here, it opens here. My header is inside the div, my nav is inside the div, my article is inside the div, my footer is inside the div. The div is wrapping everything up. I call this a wrapper div. The wrapper div is meant to put constraints on all the content that's inside of it. If I wanted to, I could set the width of that wrapper div, and everything would get either narrower or wider. I could put a background color on that wrapper div, and that background color would show up behind everything. I'm going to demonstrate how that's done. But to do so, I'm going to introduce you to a good friend of mine. It's called the ID selector. We've looked at selecting things like div before using the element selector. We directly select an element. Well, this isn't the only way of making selections. And in future videos, you're going to learn about things called class selectors, and you're going to learn more in depth about ID selectors. But I'm just going to introduce the ID selector. I'm going to create a style rule for an ID. Number symbol, wrapper. And this name here, wrapper, I can call it whatever I want. I can call it wrap. I can call it mother. I can call it taco truck. I can call it whatever I want. But usually want to give these IDs some sort of a clear descriptive semantic name. So I'm going to give it the name wrapper, because that defines the purpose of this thing. Okay? It's going to wrap up all of my content. I might even call it page wrapper. All right? And I'm going to apply a rule to this. I'm going to give it width 80%. Now, if I save this and I look at it in the browser, nothing's going to have happened with it. I made a rule right here, but I did not apply that rule to anything. There's no element in HTML called hashtag page wrapper. There just isn't. So what I can do is I can apply this to any element I want. So I've got this div that wraps everything up. I'm going to apply that ID to this div. And here's how it's done. I go into the opening tag, and right after the element, I go ID gets, so the assignment operator, and then the quotation marks, and then I have to have the name of the ID, and I have to spell it exactly. So what often I do is I will just copy it and paste it down here. So now this div is not just any old div, it's a special div. It's the page wrapper div. And it's going to get whatever styles applied to this div that I defined up here on the ID rule. So I make an ID style rule like this, and I apply that style rule to an element. Save it, look at it in the browser, and there we go. You see that my div got narrower. Everything shrunk down. I'm going to give it a background color. Tan. And now my div has a tan background color. I'm going to do something else to it. Margin auto. Margin auto is going to automatically set all of the margins to use up all available space. It's going to only find available space on the left and right side. So I set this width to 80%. That means there's 20% width left over. And what it's going to do is it's going to automatically set the left and the right side to be equal. So it'll split that 20% up evenly. It'll put 10% on the left, 10% on the right. And the effect is that it visually centers whatever element I did that to. I've talked in a previous video about avoiding the center tag, and I said that there are CSS ways of centering things. This is one way of centering things with CSS. You can set its width to some value, and then set the margin to auto. If you do that, if the width is smaller than the containing element, and there's margin left over, if you set that margin to auto, it'll automatically set the margins on left and right side equally, so it visually centers it. All right, that's a little bit about divs. We can use divs in ways like this in order to define large areas of content and style those content as a group. And in this case, I put a wrapper on all my content, gave it a defined width of 80%, and then set the margins to auto to center it. This is something you could try on your next assignment. All right, thanks for watching.